Get ready to rumble. Shilling Show Unleashed on the Seven Thunders Media Network. Former city councilor, husband, father, and community watchdog. Your host, Rob Shilling.
Welcome to the Shilling Show Unleashed podcast. Remember, your direct support makes our show possible, and you can directly support this podcast by visiting shillingshow.com and then clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page to make a monthly contribution. We appreciate your support. The Shilling Show Unleashed podcast continues, and we welcome Dan Lyman, editor-in-chief at Borderhawk.news and also foreign correspondent at InfoWars. And today we're taking an immigration and refugee worldwide overview. Dan Lyman, welcome to the Shilling Show Unleashed podcast.
Thanks so much. Great to be back with you, Rob.
First of all, I'd like you to tell us about Borderhawk.news. It's a great resource, and a lot of people need to know about it. So tell us, please.
Sure. We launched that about a year ago. Basically, we saw that there was a need for news aggregation, specifically targeting immigration issues. People will, of course, be familiar with the Drudge Report or similar news aggregation websites like that. But there was nothing that we were aware of where it was only aggregating immigration stories. So we've stepped into that hole and filled it, I feel, quite well. And we've been getting awesome response in the past year, really great quality followers and people sharing our content on social media. And we've noticed that the traffic is going up substantially as the immigration crisis across the world, especially in the United States, it grows worse and worse. And people are trying to basically find all the news that they can about it. And it can be quite hard to locate accurate news, accurate headlines, accurate content that explain what exactly is going on. So that's what we try to do on a daily basis, is aggregate news stories from the U.S. and around the world.
Yeah, it's really valuable information. You're right. It's very difficult to find. So I want people to check it out at Borderhawk.news. Dan Lyman, let's start. We're going to do this in two parts. The first one, I want to talk about America, and then we'll go to a broader perspective and take a look at what's going on in Europe. But let's talk about this influx of refugees, people coming into America for resettlement. And I want to start with the evacuations. What do we know about what's happening and who is being evacuated?
Well, that information, of course, can be a little tricky to ascertain, especially as things are moving so fast. And but what we're doing is we're keeping an eye on what people are saying from the inside sources, even politicians now who are going public with some of the data that they're ascertaining from what exactly is going on in this very fluid situation. You'd think that things couldn't get any worse with the crisis on the southern border. We have the last month, the confirmed statistics of apprehensions. Over 210,000 illegal aliens were captured at the U.S. southern border. And I think it's safe to assume that the number is probably closer to 300,000, given the fact that Border Patrol officials have definitely said that there are well over 1,000 gotaways on a daily basis at the border. And that was a few months ago. And also, you can assume that there are plenty more that are going in undetected. So by my estimations, we're well over 250,000, probably closer to 300,000. And it's possible that there are more on a monthly basis coming in through the southern border. So when you factor that in and then you say, wow, on top of that, they're bringing in tens of thousands of Afghan migrants in a very short period of time. And they're talking about the Biden administration has mentioned 65,000 as a number. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has asked for 200,000 Afghans to be brought into the U.S. The numbers really, they're staggering. And at this point, according to the Pentagon, something like 80,000 plus people have been evacuated from Afghanistan just in the last 2 weeks. And it looks like only about 4,000 of them are Americans. So your listeners can do the math on that.
So what do we know about those who are being evacuated, and how are we vetting them, if at all? Do we have any of that information?
We know very little, and you can look at the vetting process going on the southern border and imagine just how disorganized it is when you bring 80,000 people out on airplanes from a chaotic, basically a war zone, and you fly them out and you're bringing them into the country. We have them arriving all over the country already. Thousands are arriving in Virginia. They're putting them at military bases around the country in Texas and Wisconsin, and they're saying that they want to be supposedly vetting up to 9,000 people, 10,000 people on a daily basis as they bring them into the country. But really what this means is just processing, just getting some names, maybe a little bit of basic data. But we know a lot of them are coming in with no papers, no passports. Basically, very little is known about them. And U.S. intelligence officials announced yesterday, the day before, that they're aware that a minimum of 100 of these people that have been brought out of the country are already on terror watch lists. And those are just what they know in this short period of time.
Okay, so if they're on the terror watch list and they're aware of that, is there special treatment for that situation, or do we not know that answer either?
I'm not sure if we know that yet, but we do know that this is also happening in Europe. You have intelligence officials in Denmark and in France and in England who have already captured or caught up with some people from the terror watch list that have made it into their countries as well, because this same insane airlift is happening across the Western world, and they're bringing them in by the hundreds and thousands into European countries as well. So, I mean, this is just in the first few days they're realizing this, and we're only talking about people that are on terror watch lists. There are far more dangerous characters, of course, coming in with these people.
So it's interesting to me, what is the problem we're trying to solve here? Because it would seem to me that everybody who's in Afghanistan presently is in trouble and could potentially be a refugee. So do we have qualifications for who we're accepting, or a purpose in all of this?
I think at this point, it's a free-for-all. Before the collapse, you could say a week or two ago in Afghanistan, where things really went haywire, they were already talking about bringing in tens of thousands of supposed Afghan interpreters, people who supposedly helped the U.S. military in the last 20 years that we've been there. And they were making the case for that when we know for sure that there is rampant fraud in these programs. The U.S. government had already admitted that with the Iraqi situation, where we brought over a lot of people in those special immigrant visa programs, that they are suspected that at least 4,000 cases in that program were fraudulent, and that's just what the government will admit, or what they've caught. So they were already making the case for tens of thousands of Afghans to be brought into the United States and Europe before all of this went down. I think at this point it is just a total free-for-all, and there are no checks and balances. And to be honest, you have to ask yourself, how much of this really is by design, or has been planned ahead of time, or at least is the deep state, the globalist entity running the United States? How much of this works to their benefit, and they're pretty much okay with, I would say, at this point.
Dan Lyman, I'd like to be a little more explicit about that, because some people might have a sense of what you're talking about, but what is the specific purpose that would be served of the globalists if that's who's behind all of this?
Well, you can see, as we've already mentioned, these insane numbers on the southern border. Why are they allowing that to happen? You can ask yourself, how can the government be so efficient at keeping people trapped in their homes, trapped in the neighborhoods, trapped in their states in the past 18 months as they have been with these insane COVID lockdowns and restrictions? You can look at what's happening in Australia, for instance. Mm-hmm. They basically have people confined to their homes. And if you do leave your home, they release your videos of you walking out of your apartment and put a warrant out for your arrest for single individuals. So we know for a fact that they are very efficient at controlling the movement of human beings. So if they're so efficient at controlling the movement of their own citizens, then why wouldn't they be just as efficient, if not more so, at protecting our borders and restricting who comes in and out of our countries? When you see them allowing what amounts to millions of people entering the United States this year willy-nilly, or with the help of the U.S. government, you have to ask yourself, why? Why is this happening? Because you know for a fact that they could stop it in an instant if they chose.
Dan, I was listening to a national radio talk show host the other day who was in favor of bringing a lot of these people in, again, under the premise that they're friends of the United States. It was really interesting that somebody who was from Afghanistan called in to correct him and say that most of these people are not friendly to the United States philosophically. They're looking for a free ride out of Afghanistan, but they do not have good intentions for the country. I think he was a little stunned and didn't know how to react to that, but most people aren't aware.
There's an incredible naivety about these that permeates through the refugees welcome crowd. There are basically two camps. You're either foolish or you're a saboteur, and we've seen that play out, especially in recent years in Europe, since the beginning of the 2014, 2015, 2016 migration crisis. So you either have people who are totally naive about who is coming into their countries and what their behavior is like when they enter our countries. And then you have the people who actually want to see it happen. You have these NGOs, these groups, like in Europe, for instance, that operate the rescue ships. They call them, I call them Antifa of the Sea. They are constantly collecting hundreds or thousands of migrants that are coming off the coast of Africa, for instance, and bringing them directly to Europe. We've been experiencing that here. I live in Europe. I've lived here for years now, and been covering the European immigration situation, especially as it pertains to crime for years now. And so, going back to the fact that people are very naive about what exactly is going on, I would like to direct your listeners to check out an article that will really open their eyes if they're not aware themselves. In the National Interest, it was published in 2017 by a woman who's actually worked advocating for refugees and for asylum seekers for many years, basically all of her professional life, according to her. It's by Cheryl Bernard, and it's called "I've Worked with Refugees for Decades. Europe's Afghan Crime Wave is Mind-Boggling." And she basically explains that initially at the onset of the migration crisis in 2014, 2015, she felt that these people definitely needed to be helped, and she felt that it was definitely the responsibility of the Western world to welcome them in. And in the few short years between that and the writing of this article, she realized just how dangerous specifically Afghan migrants can be, Afghan males specifically. The incidence of sexual assault and rape and murder in Europe has spiked substantially in recent years, specifically due to the import of migrants and Afghans in particular. And she points out towards the end of her article, according to Austrian police statistics, Syrian refugees cause fewer than 10% of sexual assault cases, while Afghans, whose numbers are comparable, are responsible for a stunning half of all cases. That's in Austria alone. People don't realize how dangerous so many of these Afghan males are. I cover so many crime stories in Europe, and very often it's Afghan males responsible for these crimes, and they're horrifying crimes, and they're happening on a daily basis throughout Europe.
You mentioned Syria, and I want to find out what it is we've learned or should have learned from a previous influx to America from Syria and Somalia. Are there lessons there?
Sure, absolutely. These countries that destabilize, or we destabilize them, and then we intake large swaths of their populations. It's not good for the host nations. It's also not good for the nations that they need to be. Syria has a long way to go if they're going to rebuild their nation from years and years of civil war. And if you allow large groups of their population, especially young males, to just exit the country, then you're also hurting their homelands, and some might call it a brain drain. You also might call it just a physical capability drain in terms of rebuilding these countries from years and years of war. So it certainly doesn't benefit us. It costs us untold sums of money, and it certainly doesn't benefit them in the long run.
The Schilling Show Unleashed podcast will continue with our guest, Dan Lyman, in just a moment.
Online at shillingshow.com.
Borderhawk.news is a one-stop shop with the latest news about immigration nationalism and globalism. The Borderhawk staff daily curates immigration news stories, and in the fashion of the Drudge Report, updates the site with cutting-edge content and original first-class commentary. Borderhawk.news highlights national and international media reports, tweets, and nuggets buried in local news blurbs, polls, video clips, and policy research. Borderhawk is pro-legal immigration, pro-rule of law, but against an unsecure border as countless Americans have suffered violence at the hands of criminal illegal aliens. And an increasing number of Americans are concerned about how mass migration affects their daily life. Borderhawk.news will remain on the forefront of the immigration issue with a buffet of info to read, evaluate, and share. Bookmark Borderhawk.news. Add them on social media at Borderhawk.news on Twitter.
Shilling Show Unleashed.
The Shilling Show Unleashed podcast returns with Dan Lyman from Borderhawk.news. Dan, I want to talk about coronavirus travel rules and precautions that are being waived. I had a report the other day right here in Charlottesville that there were a lot of sick people that have been just trucked up here or flown up here from the border that were inhabiting local hotels, and everyone was sworn to secrecy about it. So what is going on with the vetting and checking for health?
You know, that's another great question. We find ourselves increasingly restricted as citizens of our Western countries, as citizens of Europe, as citizens of the United States, and increasingly harder to fly, to cross borders, even to, at this point now, enter restaurants and cafes in large parts of Europe now, and also in the United States in some blue cities. So as citizens, we find ourselves essentially second class to a group of people who are thrown on buses, thrown on planes with very little checks as to their health or as to their status. You know, we've been reporting at InfoWars and also at Borderhawk for months now that the airport in McAllen, Texas, and other airports, of course, near the southern border, are flooded with illegal aliens who are basically brought in by either federal authorities or by charity groups, NGOs. They're brought to these airports. They're handed envelopes full of cash, and then they're pre-boarded onto airplanes ahead of paying customers without any checks on their identification, without really any verification as to their health status. And then they're placed on these planes with other unknowing American citizens who are paying for their tickets and who are subsequently, of course, forced to wear masks on these planes to supposedly prevent the spread of coronavirus. And they're put on these planes to people who have dubious health status, not just of coronavirus, but of course other communicable diseases, and flown around the country with them. And, very little is done to check the health condition of many of these people coming in. And, we've seen the border hospitals in Texas and in California have been overwhelmed by COVID-sick illegal aliens who are just pouring into the country, and we're being forced to treat them, of course, on our dime.
So I want to get into that because we're hearing numbers of people being dumped all across America, small towns, big towns, and so forth. What leverage do governors have in response to this, and are they being included in these resettlement decisions being made by the federal government?
I would imagine plenty of governors are being included, especially the ones who are welcoming them. We had just reported a few days ago that at least 10 governors in the U.S. were open arms to Afghan, quote unquote, refugees. So you can imagine they, of course, would also be open arms to illegal aliens entering the U.S. through the southern border. I'm sure there are plenty of governors that are clued in, and you see what happens when they do anything to attempt to reject the resettlement of illegal aliens in their states, such as Ron DeSantis, constantly under siege for trying to prevent that process from happening in his state. These are very crafty entities that are working, scouting out parts of the U.S. to resettle illegal aliens, Afghan refugees from other parts of the world. They're constantly on the lookout. We have federal contractors constantly on the lookout, especially in states where they see there's a political need to put tens of thousands of people from around the world who will be ultimately on the government dole, and they can have their the leash yanked at any time in terms of getting them to ensure that they vote Democrat to do that in red states. So they're definitely resettling finding many of them in Texas and Florida. They're looking around places like Idaho, Montana, as they have been for years. I even saw the other day on Refugee Resettlement Watch, it was a warning, it was a guest post that they're basically looking to put as many as they can into West Virginia. And so, I think people really need to be aware of how deep this agenda runs, and that they're stuffing them in every corner of the U.S., especially where it's politically expedient.
Yeah, finally on that topic, I did hear Alan West interviewed by Steve Bannon recently, and he, of course, challenging Greg Abbott for governor in Texas. And Alan West stated that as governor of Texas, he would push back against the federal government and do whatever needed to do, that he was not willing to accept this. Do you think that there will be other governors rising up in America, or are we hopelessly lost in that area?
There are very few people in our corner. I think there's even people are realizing that somebody like Kristi Noem in South Dakota really is just is a shell, an imposter. So in terms of that agenda, we have very, very few people on our side. Even DeSantis is good on many things, and he's pretty good on the immigration situation. But we still see that Afghan refugees are being tucked already in Florida. They're being resettled there. We have John Binder at Breitbart is reporting that they're already being tucked in Florida. We have illegal aliens that are being put on buses in Texas and sent to Florida. There really is so little political pushback from governors in these states to really seal off the borders, because in many ways, they are beholden to the federal government for funding and certain things like that.
Dan Lyman, let's switch to Europe, where you reside, and help us to understand the European immigration system and how it works.
The situation in Europe, let's start off first with the Afghan refugee situation. They are already being dumped all across Western Europe, specifically. Just did a story yesterday for InfoWars Europe, a small Dutch village that's in the Netherlands. Their population approximately 3,500 people. They are currently receiving 800 Afghan refugees at a military camp there. That's just one snapshot of what's going on here. And the residents there turned out to protest for good reason. And the entire mainstream media, the Dutch mainstream media, including other European outlets, as well as Dutch officials, local and at the federal level, have all come out and denounced the protesters as racists, as Nazis, as being unwelcoming, unchristian in some of these reports as well. And that's just one example of what's going on in terms of Afghans coming into Europe right now. We have the British government has pledged to take 20,000 in the coming years. They said they're ready to take 5,000 immediately. That's on top of what's already happening in the UK in terms of this incredible crisis on the English Channel. They just set another record the other day. 800 migrants crossed the English Channel from France in a single day. And they're approaching somewhere between 20 and 30,000 for this year, which is just blowing away all historical numbers. And it's another example of a government that has done such an incredibly efficient job of preventing their citizens from moving about freely in the past 18 months, while assisting migrants to cross into their country illegally. The UK border force has been caught on multiple occasions and basically on a daily basis, basically going out into the water and fishing migrants off of these small vessels and fetching them, I should say, and putting them onto border force boats and bringing them to the UK. And they have been allowing this to happen and facilitating it now for a couple of years. And it continues to grow worse, despite the fact that UK politicians continue to vow that they're going to put an end to it. It only gets worse. And that's just another snapshot of what's going on in Europe. They are pouring in from all corners. They're pouring into Spain, Spanish territories off the coast of Africa and on the African continent. Spain has 2 autonomous cities that are located within Morocco, and those cities are constantly under siege by migrants who are coming in from all around Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa. I report on that frequently. And basically, as soon as they touch Spanish soil, even on the African continent, they can apply for asylum, especially if they claim to be underage. We had an incident last month of the month before where the Moroccan border guards stood down and they allowed 10,000 estimated African migrants to storm a single Spanish city in the span of 24 hours. So it's just a relentless push of migrants coming into Europe, and they're here, as there is in the U.S., very little political will to stop them. And anyone who does attempt to is basically sabotaged and removed from office. People like Matteo Salvini and Christian Strache in Austria. These were guys that became interior ministers of their countries and did their very best to put an end to illegal migration, and were quickly run out of office through a variety of means. They were sabotaged, essentially. There's very little political will to stop illegal migration into Europe, and which makes this entire situation in Afghanistan even more troubling, because we're going to see waves upon waves. There are certain EU officials who are saying behind the scenes that this could be worse than the 2015 migration crisis.
Are there other countries in Europe that are pushing back, that are maintaining tight control of their borders? Are there any examples?
There are examples. Of course, your listeners would be familiar with Hungary, I'm sure. Poland has done a reasonably good job. What's interesting also, there's another development on the immigration front in Europe, is that in the past 6 months to a year, relations between Belarus, who is not an EU country, but technically European, and the EU officials and EU member states has been deteriorating. And a couple months ago, the leader of Belarus, Lukashenko, he said, basically as a threat, if you're going to, basically continue to escalate these tensions, I'm going to flood Europe with illegal migrants and drugs. And people said, wow, well, let's see if that happens. And sure enough, illegal migrants, particularly from Iraq, began pouring into neighboring Lithuania. And Lithuania is a tiny little country which basically hasn't experienced much illegal migration issues because of their location at all. But all of a sudden, 4,000 illegal migrants have poured into Lithuania in recent months. And that is also happening with other member states of the EU that border Belarus, including Latvia, Poland, and Estonia. And so it's another front that has been opened on the illegal immigration situation, and Belarus is basically facilitating it. They're allowing migrants to fly into Minsk, and then the Belarusian officials and the border guards are escorting the migrants right to the border of the EU and basically sending them on in. So that's another thing that has been developing, and these countries are doing a reasonable job of trying to repel these migrants. Poland has always done a pretty good job on that, but it's another issue to be dealt with, and it's another avenue that has been opened. So we'll see what happens with that. That's a continually evolving situation. And then on the Greek front, Greece has really been hit hard in recent years by illegal migration, and they really were kind of submerged in a way in 2015, 2016 by illegal migrants, especially those coming across the sea and coming in through Turkey. And they're basically the entry point into the EU for migrants coming from the Middle East and particularly from Afghanistan. They'll pass through Iran and then enter into Turkey and then find their way to the Greek border. And Turkey has used those migrants in a weaponized fashion right before the outbreak of the coronavirus in Europe, when the borders started closing. Just before that happened, Turkey actually basically opened the borders and told migrants that they had been holding within the borders to make their way into Europe. And there was quite a clash along the border between Turkey and Greece. And the Greeks did an admirable job of repelling hundreds of thousands of migrants attempting to enter Europe through that point. And since then, they've been building more border fortifications, and they recently completed another long stretch of border wall in anticipation of more Afghan migrants making their way towards Greece. So there is a little bit of push and pull, and there's a little bit of deterrence. It's a pretty large border. So you really need all countries, all hands on deck, and that's really not the case in Europe. So when one avenue is closed, another opens.
Dan Lyman, it's such a big subject, and we've just scratched the surface, but if you would please tell our listeners where they can follow you online and get more important news.
Sure, absolutely. I encourage them to visit Borderhawk.news on a daily basis. We are updating all the stories there, and they can get an eye in basically a snapshot as to what's going on around the world. You can also find me on Twitter at Citizen Analyst, the same on Gab And you can find all my work at europewars.com or newswars.com.
Dan, thanks for joining us today on the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast.
Thank you.
That concludes another edition of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Visit us online at shillingshow.com, where you can directly support this podcast by clicking on the Patreon banner at the top of the page and making a monthly donation. Your support is essential for the continuation of the Schilling Show Unleashed podcast. Until next time.